Welcome to the Elite Universe, Commander. My name is Drew Wager, a lifelong fan of the Elite franchise. If you're looking for an orientation on this decade-spanning game, you've come to the right place. This is the Metalore, the second Elite of 1993. With Elite itself having been a dramatic success as mentioned before, attention eventually turned to a successor game. Work on Elite 2, still on the original 8-bit hardware from the 1980s, started with both Ian Bell and David Braben involved in creating a possible sequel to the original game on the BBC and C64 microcomputers. Reports differ on why this didn't come to fruition, though it seems that the 8-bit hardware was too limited, and enthusiasm for the project, with other interests taking their toll on time, ultimately put paid to the work. Frontier Elite 2, commonly abbreviated to merely FE2, came along almost 10 years after the original game, being published by Konami in 1993, with the rights later sold to GameTek. It was primarily written by David Braben, though Ian Bell provided some algorithms for drawing planets and design work on control methods. When Frontier Elite 2, the second game, finally did appear, it was exclusively a 16-bit affair, being made available for the major platforms of the early 90s. The now ancient 8-bit computers were history, and the immediate future belonged to the PC, the Commodore Amiga, and the Atari ST. Frontier Elite 2 also featured one of the most cinematic game intros that had been seen up until that point, and it's still worth watching today to get a feel of how the game introduced itself. Original music, particularly the intro, a rousing piece of classical music with a military theme, was composed by the legendary David Lowe. For many, this is still the definitive Elite theme. Other classical works featured in the game too, rendered at various levels of quality depending on the capabilities of the machines at the time. The best was considered to be a PC equipped with the expensive Roland LAPC sound system, closely followed by the Commodore Amiga. The game featured considerable advances and changes over the original, gone with the simplistic wireframe graphics, replaced by fully filled polygonal spacecraft with moving parts and articulated undercarriages. The PC version featured early shading on spacecraft exteriors. The game was now set in a particular era, the year 3200. The original game had no fixed date, but has been assumed to have been set in the year 3125. In Frontier Elite 2 you played a grandchild of the original player. A political background was introduced. The Federation and the Empire appeared as two galactic superpowers vying for territory, and the player was able to rank up with both of them. This was a significant departure from the original game, which appeared to be set in an imaginary series of galaxies controlled by the mysterious Galactic Cooperative, or GALCOP. This was, perhaps, the first major retcon of the Elite universe. The universe was now semi-realistic, with real stars, orbited in real time by multiple planets simulated with real astronomical detail, and a nascent 1-to-1 scale galaxy convincingly represented, although space had turned blue for some strange reason. Frontier Elite 2 also featured a game engine capable of rendering travel through astronomically accurate and realistically sized space down to scale planetary surfaces, which, though sparse in detail by today's standards, were convincingly represented with billboards, roads, houses, mountains, clouds, craters, and rivers. You could land on all planets with solid surfaces, regardless of whether they had an atmosphere or not. Frontier Elite 2 did include a small subset of the original game systems, collectively known as the Old Worlds, and players will still be familiar with Lave, Deso, Gridquat, Riort, and Tir Nizla. This led to the lore that marked the demise of GALCOP itself, which was explained as a socio-economic collapse of that political entity sometime prior to 3200. Players had the option to start in the Lave system as in the original game, but had to pay a fine if they wanted to enter the territories of the Federation or the Empire. Another option was to start on Mars, though most players would start the game on the Ice Moon Merlin in the Ross 154 system, with a basic Mark I Eagle. Another major retcon removed all of the alien life from the Elite universe. In the original game, various planets were populated by spacefaring creatures, notably insectoids, birds, felines, and amphibioids. No explanation of this was ever given, they were simply gone. Lore consistency in the Elite franchise has never been a strong point. Most controversially of all, the flight mechanics of the game were based upon Newtonian physics rather than the traditional airplanes in space trope common to most spaceflight games of the time. This certainly gave a sense of realism, but it was a controversial choice for gameplay, often leading to a jousting style of combat and a certain difficulty in flying your ship, necessitating the almost mandatory use of an autopilot for navigation and docking for most players. Alas, the autopilot was not all that reliable, meaning that a fiery death dive into a star or planet was a frequent occurrence. Combat dullness could be mitigated to a degree by, counterintuitively, switching off your engines, but the frenzied attacks common to the previous game were never matched. Various planetary and stellar types were represented, with different effects being applied to atmospheres, gas giants, and even planetary rings. The same engine was able to render a clock tower, with a working clock, at point-blank range. And the game also featured a sophisticated external camera. The player could now change their ship, and many of the ships from the original game were featured, along with new ones, though only one ship could be owned at a time. The mechanics of space travel were also quite different. Gone was the tourist drive featured in the earlier versions. Ships in Frontier Elite 2 travelled through space in real time, taking days or weeks to reach their destinations. This was rendered playable by the use of the Star Dreamer, which accelerated time from the perspective of the player. Ships travelled in hyperspace or traditional space using their engines, accelerating and decelerating to their destination by use of their main thrusters. Remarkably, and once again due to the magic of procedural generation, all of this was contained on a single floppy disk, around 720 kilobytes on the PC version. The game was originally written in about 250,000 lines of 68,000 assembly code, which was native for the Amiga and the ST. This was then ported to the 8286 processor for the PC by Chris Sawyer, and anyone familiar with these two processor architectures will appreciate the Herculean task involved. The game taxed those early machines, with performance being quite poor on the early iterations, particularly on the Amiga and the ST, though later versions of the hardware solved this successfully. Once again, the game was accompanied by works of fiction, in this case a collection of short stories entitled Stories of Life on the Frontier, and there was a gazetteer of particular worlds. There was also an interesting flaw, the so-called wormhole bug. Due to a miscalculation of jump range, the player could jump multiples of 655.35 light-years without using additional fuel, and by clever triangulation, vast distances could be covered by judicious plotting. There were some curious omissions too. The ubiquitous bad guys from the first game, the Thargoids, were almost totally absent from the game, and none of the original mysteries such as Raxler and the Dark Wheel were expanded upon at all. Whilst the open-ended nature of the game was true to the original, there was no obvious scripted missions present in the game, though there were various simple missions ranging from assassination contracts, passenger missions, to slightly more complex photographic reconnaissance. These missions were given by photo-fit individuals, and the player had a series of prompted responses they could give to queries. Also introduced were new bits of technology such as the Hyperspace Analyzer, allowing you to track ships and intercept them at their destinations. Assassination missions used this particular piece of game design to good effect. With a more powerful drive, you were able to overtake other ships in hyperspace and arrive at their destination before they did, allowing you to ambush them. Most reviews of the game were positive, with many citing the scale, realistic physics and sheer ambition of the game. Quite a few commented to the effect that gameplay was boring as a result of the Newtonian physics, and certainly some of the visceral nature of the combat from the original game was missing, though it definitely has its loyal fans. Somewhere near 500,000 copies were sold, and for many players beginning their gaming in the 90s, this was their first Elite. It would be followed by another sequel within a mere 2 years.